So what are some of the key aspects of this framework that I really want to pull out today? Well, as opposed to that tangible, the 1972 World Heritage Convention, with the 2003 convention, states, parties, national governments hold the most power. So we must really remember that when UNESCO, negotiations between that top international level of UNESCO and the local level where intangible cultural heritage lives, negotiations must go through and communication must go through national governments. So that middle level, if we have 3 levels, is really important to remember. However, the convention is rather vague. Montira touched upon this also yesterday. How it's going to be implemented is really up to national governments to decide. What ministries, agencies, organizations, museums, universities are to, would be responsible for safeguarding intangible heritage of a territory. Again, this is up to governments. Perhaps this is an advantage, but we'll talk about that later. But the idea of community involvement is also rather vague. While Montira said that the convention gives a lot of power to the local level and practitioners of intangible heritage, that can be questioned. Within the convention text, the idea of community involvement, again, is up to national governments. Here we have an example, the only article that's dedicated to community participation, Article 15. And it states, each state party shall endeavor to ensure the widest possible participation of communities, groups, and where appropriate, individuals that create, maintain, and transmit such heritage, and so forth. What's really important to highlight here is that it's vague. Shall endeavor to ensure the widest possible participation. To what extent are communities going to be involved? Who decides? And again, it's a national government decision. So really, is there power at the local level? Can be questioned. So at this point, just some guiding questions. What are the limitations of this current framework we need to start thinking about, particularly the concept of intangible heritage? Can this framework safeguard intangible cultural heritage effectively? So effectiveness is a real key idea. What is effectiveness? And how do we determine that? And are we going to transform intangible heritage, or are we really going to help it survive? And later, again, I'll talk about some benefits and strengths, just throwing that in there since I'm going to be critiquing a lot. So now let's move on to some precursors of this concept. Again, the term is new, but the idea of cultural practices and beliefs and knowledge and skills is not. So we know the definition by now, I hope, of intangible heritage. And the main domains or examples of this type of heritage that UNESCO puts forward: oral traditions and expressions, performing arts, social practices, rituals and festive events, knowledge and practices concerning nature and the universe, traditional craftsmanship. So this idea of categorizing and creating these groups of cultural diversity is really nothing new. If we go back to early anthropological and folklore studies from the mid-19th century to early 20th century, there were other terms that were used to categorize human cultural behavior, beliefs. Terms such as cultural traits, trait complexes, so we have families of traits that are related to each other. This idea of survivals, so these traditions and beliefs that have been deemed older and outmoded at the present time, but yet somehow have survived, and therefore they provide clues of time before, almost like fossils in geology. And anthropological studies in particular mainly focus on exotic, far-off cultures and peoples, generally outside of Europe. And folklore studies at the beginning focused on lower classes, peasants, classes of Europe, again because of these survivalist idea of these old traditions that don't exist anymore in the higher classes. So let's look at them to understand our past as human beings universally. So these terms really were used as measuring blocks, so whittling down diversity to more general categories. And they were used to compare and contrast different cultures, groups, to find similarities. So in a way, we're diminishing diversity. And some have argued that this idea, these aims of early anthropological and folklore studies, that legacy still exists in the intangible cultural heritage concept. One example is I'll just briefly go through this, early anthropologist Whistler is also the curator of the Museum of Natural History in New York. 1923, he put forth this universal culture pattern, so all cultures have this pattern, have these categories of cultural behaviors. There are 9. One is missing at the end, obviously. All right, so speech, material traits, art, mythology, religious practices, family and social systems, property, government, and the one that's missing is war. It's also a category of cultural behavior and beliefs, strategy, warfare, etc. And so I was thinking these categories can be matched to those UNESCO domains. And so I matched them. And so looking at Whistler's speech category, that could translate into UNESCO's oral traditions and expressions group. Material traits could correspond to traditional craftsmanship. Art, performing art, some art practices. Mythology, scientific knowledge, that resonates with this category of knowledge and practices concerning nature and the universe. Religious practices, social practices, rituals, and festive events. The same with family and social systems. Again, social practices, rituals. And these last 3 categories of Whistler's idea could correspond to social practices, rituals, and festive events of UNESCO, but UNESCO really doesn't deal with such expressions, and I'll get to that in a moment. So my main point here is that we're going from specific, nuanced, local expressions, and we're whittling them down to more general categories. So in effect, we're diminishing diversity, we're diminishing specificity, and moving towards more general. We're moving also towards diversity to universality. That's especially reflected in the representative list of intangible heritage of all humanity. So this idea of we all universally should relate to expressions that we don't know of and that are from other parts of the world, and that they correspond to all of us. So it's important to understand that diminishment of difference, of specificity, of uniqueness. And this takes us to Barbara Kirschenblatt's idea of metacultural production. And she argues that heritage, the heritage enterprise in general, is just the creation of registers, groups, selections, lists. And she says lists arise from operations that convert selected aspects of localized descent heritage into translocal consent heritage, the heritage of humanity. And that phrase should be rather familiar to you. UNESCO uses that phrase often. Again, it's at the title of the representative list. It's the heritage of everyone. And Hafstein has also argued that really intangible cultural heritage, this term, this concept, is just a seal of approval. It's a label we apply to those that have been selected, those expressions and beliefs. It's a label placed upon selected cultural practices so that they become intangible cultural heritage. So they become something. That's the metacultural movement. And Kirschenblatt-Gimblett also notes that world heritage in general, however, intangible cultural heritage specifically, is first and foremost a list, a selection, a group. Everything on the list, whatever its previous context and previous values, significance, meanings, is now placed in relationship with other masterpieces or those that are selected. And so the context for these new selected, these heritage items or representations of heritage, the context is just being in relation to others that have been selected. And that's the essence of metacultural production and valorizing heritage practices. New values are added. They're important at a local, specific level, and then they become important at a national level or regional. Then they become important at an international level. They're universal. They become important to all of humanity. Those are new values. So what happens to the original source values? So one key question we can ask at this point is, how do we make sure that local diversity, the meanings, again, the nuances, specificity, remain intact while safeguarding intangible heritage so that they don't become diluted by these other new meanings? So really, how can we keep intangible cultural heritage invigorated, vitalized, and therefore local?